This is Penzance Part 2. As Jonathan waited, he reflected on his father's words at breakfast that morning. His father was always at the breakfast table before him and had grunted a greeting without taking his eyes away from the morning paper. Breakfast was always the same: porridge and fruit, followed by toast and jam, and 3 or 4 cups of the finest Indian black tea. His father always sat with his back to the window, something Jonathan had often wondered about. In a way it was a blessing, because it meant his father was nothing but a black shadow, framed by the fine view across the bay to St. Michael's Mount. After finishing his toast, his father had carefully laid the paper down on the table. "Rowland's philanthropy is in the news again," he'd said. "Dexterous intellect, that one, and a keen eye. A fine, upstanding young man." With that he had left the room, leaving Jonathan to ponder once again his shortcomings when compared to his cousin Rowland. Jonathan didn't like Rowland. He was a dubious character who exploited his workforce and pounced on weakness like a dog on a rabbit. Jonathan, on the other hand, had never wanted power or wealth. All he'd ever wanted was to write books that would sit on the shelves of grand country houses and city libraries. His father disliked books, and in an effort to rid the boy of his silly ideas, had incarcerated Jonathan in his tin smelting factory on his 15th birthday, where Jonathan had endured for 16 years as office manager. Jonathan hated it. His father's stern countenance and severe words acted like a pestle and mortar, crushing and grinding his spirit into dust. When his father appeared in the doorway, he was waving a piece of paper in his leathery hand, his wedding ring glinting in a single shaft of sunlight coming in through the high window that was barred against intruders. Jonathan thought how his father's role as a husband was his only redeeming feature, for to his credit he treated Mama with kindness and respect. "What's wrong with you?" his father raged from across the room. "This order should have gone out yesterday. Instead I find it waiting for your signature. Imbecile! You'll have us bankrupt. If they cancel my boy, I'll stop your pay for the next 6 months. Do you hear me?" This barrage of abuse was nothing out of the ordinary. His father belittled him and hurled insults at him at every opportunity. But today something snapped inside Jonathan, like a malformed limb suddenly straightening. There was no debate inside his head, no shouldn't I. There was not even any hesitation. It was almost as if someone else was in control of his actions. Maybe today Jonathan had just had enough. For when the spirit moves, empires crash to the ground and worlds can fall apart in the blinking of an eye. Without a word, he rose from his desk and walked over to his father in 4 measured steps. Being 6 inches taller, he wondered fleetingly why he'd let this little man bully him for all these years. Taking the paper out of his father's hand, he ripped it into tiny shreds and scattered them over his father's head in a dramatic gesture of defiance. The flurry of paper stuck on the grey hair that ran in an arc around the shiny head, like falling snow on an unkempt Cornish hedge. His father, clearly in the most dreadful shock, only stood there, mouth agape, flustering and puffing over half-formed words that made no sense. Jonathan knew it was only a matter of time before his father would gather himself, and he didn't want to be around when that happened. He walked quickly out of the office and down the corridor. He didn't want to run, it would be unseemly, but the tea lady reported later that she'd seen him leave the building as if the devil himself was on his tail. As soon as he was out of sight of the factory, he ran like the wind and didn't stop until he reached the promenade. Out of breath and shaking from the shock of his rebellion, he stood and looked at the sea. He saw the vastness of it, the bounty of its depths and the power of its motion. Its strength stirred his soul. The April sea breeze was strong, and it tousled his hair and melted his mouth into a smile. He laughed out loud, cautiously at first, afraid that someone might hear. A furtive glance behind him assured him he was entirely alone. The place was empty except for him and the fullness of his joy. The burden of expectation was gone. Like the waves, he could go wherever the wind blew him. Yes, he was a disappointment. Yes, he was a failure. But now those things could be celebrated because they had brought him his freedom. He raised up his arms to the sun and whispered, "Hallelujah," into the wind. But it wasn't the voice of a conqueror, it was the voice of a servant praising the Lord for his servitude. So he did it again, louder this time. "Hallelujah!" Still not loud enough. Next time he yelled it at the top of his voice. "Hallelujah!" And he kept on yelling until he felt like some great general of a mighty army whose voice could surely be heard right across the sea to the Bay of Biscay. The straitjacket that had held him secure and immobilised for 30 years fell away like an old skin. If you'd been there, you'd have seen the change in his eyes. The dullness faded and the light of his spirit shone out. He jumped down onto the beach, kicking up sand and pebbles in great eddies of joy. His fine leather shoes, delivered from Harrods only the week before, were wet and scuffed, but he didn't care one hoot for them. Getting down on his hands and knees, he explored the rock pools and the beach like he used to when he was too young to know any better. A tiny fragment of a bright, clean shell, glowing yellow in the late morning sun, made him remember cold ice cream and hot summers, and he gathered it up into his hand. And here, a piece of green glass, worn smooth and round by the ocean, the colour of the moss that covered the trees he used to climb in the old wood. A blue frond of seaweed filled him with the excitement of a dark sky during a thunderstorm, and a pebble covered in orange lichen brought back memories of that first hesitant kiss by the stoop gate at Farmer Jones's barn. He picked them all up, cradling them in the palm of his hand like precious jewels.